This is a short story that I wrote for an anthology called A Mistake in Time. There were all sorts of criteria that I had to do for this particular anthology. Like, they had a criteria and I had to come up with a story that matched it. So I'm not going to bore you with the details of that. If you want that kind of stuff, hit my Patreon page. I talk about that kind of thing. But it's an interesting story with somewhat of a twist. A lot of my stories have twists, so I hope you like this one. Check it out.
Certainly no one knew at the time what would eventually happen. I mean, who could have possibly guessed? It seemed like such a great idea. If someone had told you it would lead to the end of the world, you would have thought he was nuts, right? I wasn't exactly sure how to interpret this gush of words from the gentleman on my couch. I had experience with my fair share of whack jobs, being a psychiatrist and all, but this man's story was pretty batty. When he lay down 40 minutes or so ago and told me that I wouldn't believe what he was about to tell me, I had taken it with a grain of salt. Normally, I would most certainly believe what my patients told me, and if I couldn't, it was because, well, being delusional, what they said wasn't actually true. And really, what did he expect me to think when he began to spiel with, I'm from the future? It begins about 50 or 60 years in the future, circa 2015. Someone has developed a method of disposing corpses in an eco-friendly way. The method involves encasing the body in what is basically a seed, and then planting it under a small sapling, so that the tree can use it as nourishment. The premise would kill two birds with one stone: lack of space for burials, and our dwindling forests. Come to think of it, in theory, it really is a good idea, if it's indeed feasible. Anyway, the story continues that this pod burial, as he put it, went from unusual to trendy to common to traditional in a matter of decades. By 2050, it was the accepted manner of disposal for human remains, and all other means were looked upon as decidedly weird. Then, to my amazement, Joe, as he calls himself, he has no ID to prove this claim, skipped ahead about 500 years to 2573. According to him, this was an important date. In fact, it was April 12th, 2573 to be precise, when the first tree, nurtured solely on a person, became animated. It seems, if you believe this ridiculousness, at this point that these, what had now become huge plants, had attained quite a taste for people, and when the very last of their human sustenance was exhausted, they decided to go find themselves some more. That's right, go. Apparently being fed men and women for 500 years allowed the various plants to develop very human-like abilities. Thus began the Age of Slaughter, as Joe put it, where the trees came to life one by one and began hunting down the population. After over 500 years of repeated planting, the carnivorous fauna raised on the dead outnumbered the living 3-1. And because they acquired the mental capacity as well as physical traits of humans, they made extremely fierce and efficient hunters, who were incredibly difficult to kill, especially after they discovered methods to put out the fires people used at first to destroy them. For the next section, Joe moved forward another 100 years and explained how there were very few people left, and that the trees had completely taken over the planet and begun breeding animals for food. However, this new supply didn't stop them from hunting humans, as we were now considered a delicacy. The remaining folks had been driven underground, where they had forwarded a plan to send a person back in time to stop pod burials before they could ever begin and save the human race. Joe, it seems, is that savior. Not that I'm any judge of who should or should not be chosen for such a monumental task, and naturally I never got the chance to peruse the candidates for the job, but if I was in charge, I'd like to believe I would have definitely chosen someone younger. Joe had to be closing in on 70 years old. So, explain to me exactly how it was that you were sent back in time, I asked, feigning as much belief as I could for this tale. This is all so terribly interesting. Truth be told, I was quite curious, if only for psychological reasons. A case like this could land me in the medical journals. Well, Joe began picking up the threads of his story, I couldn't tell you too much about the science of it all, but the machine looked like a huge trebucket. I sat in the seat and it literally flung me through time. I was forced to stifle a guffaw at the mental image, and coughed into my sleeve while pushing him to continue. The problem was that at the exact moment I was to be dispatched, the lemurs burst in. I didn't know exactly where to go with this statement. I simply asked, "The lemurs?" "Oh, yes. I forgot to mention that the trees used lemurs as a sort of slave labor," said Joe, as if this were the most natural occurrence in the world. "Lemurs," I repeated. "Cute little monkey-looking animals with big eyes and fingers." Joe actually shuddered at the memory. "Yes, horrible creatures." And that was it. I simply couldn't continue. You do realize how completely insane that sounds, don't you? "What?" asked Joe. "Lemurs? As slave labor for trees? Yes." Joe stared blankly at me, apparently not knowing what to say next, and then he sat up. He rolled back his sleeve and began rhythmically tapping the back of his wrist. When he was finished, he turned that wrist to me. He was wearing what I assumed to be a watch, with an overlarge face on it. However, when I glanced at it, I assumed to read the time, I was startled and amazed to find moving pictures. It was as if Joe was wearing a miniature television, and on this set there was indeed a lemur. In fact, there were many lemurs, and they were driving about in what appeared to be tiny automobiles, holding a steaming cup in one hand, a watering can in the other, and steering the vehicles with their feet. They all seemed quite agitated as one by one they leapt from their cars, sprinkled the bases of the enormous trees, whose lengths continued out of frame, drank their steaming cups, jumped back into their cars, and sped off on their way. What is that?" I stammered, referring to the magical contraption on Joe's arm. "Those are the lemurs," he said, pointing at the screen. "They're all completely addicted to coffee and can become extremely aggressive if you knock the cup from their hand. Drive around watering the trees and performing other menial tasks. We learned to stay away from them early on. There's nothing worse than over-caffeinated lemurs stuck in traffic." Joe laid back down on the couch, thought for a moment, and then he went on. "So, the lemurs burst in, guns blazing, just as the scientists are sending me hurtling back in time. I'm fairly certain everyone in the room was killed. But somehow, they were able to set off the bucket. Unfortunately, something went horribly wrong. Whether it was a miscalculation by the scientists, the lemurs fouling up the instruments, or some other terrible mistake, I was sent to the wrong time. When I landed, I was in 1936. "My goodness!" I exclaimed with genuine interest. The motion pictures with the lemurs had sucked me into Joe's story as if I were part of it myself. "That's a good 80 years off." "Well, more like 60, said Joe dismissively. "I was only able to bring one object with me to the future, so there I was, in Italy, naked, in a field, in 1936. Took me quite a bit of time to get settled. Hell, just to deduce what had gone wrong and then figure out what I needed to do to fix things. Of course, World War II began right about then, and it became even more difficult for me to accomplish my mission. In fact, it has taken me these past 30 years to find you." "Wait, what? To find me?" I asked, completely perplexed. "Yes, of course. You see, my original goal was to locate the woman who had invented the pod burial in 2015. I was sent back somewhere to the year 2000 to kill her. Yes, I know it's definitely a bit Terminator and all, but there you have it." He stopped for a moment and chuckled, though I had no clue what he was talking about. "A bit Terminator?" "When I discovered that I was in 1936, I realized that my only choice was to wait. Literally, I had to wait until she was born, despite the fact that I didn't even know when and where that might be. I mean, I'd seen pictures of her and read her bio multiple times, but since that information wasn't at all pertinent to my mission, I'd never bothered to memorize it. I'm fairly certain she was born sometime in the 1960s in Italy, but that's about all. It was okay, though. The original plan had me committing the act when she was in her middle age, and that was no longer an option. Still, if I had to wait 40 or 50 years to find this teenage girl, then I suppose I could. That is, until I recently discovered I have terminal cancer, and I may not even finish out the year. Obviously, my plan had to change, and quick. Didn't take much of a leap to determine the person who needed to be removed from history was the inventor's father. That, of course, is you, Dr. Cicelli. Terror at the realization of my situation became acute as Joe first sat up and then stood up. To my horror, I noticed that he was between me and the only door in the room. My training immediately kicked in, and I tried to reason with this lunatic. But I don't have children! Not yet, Joe countered. He drew a small metal object from his back pocket, and I immediately flinched away, fearing a revolver. But it more closely resembled a tiny silver pencil. What is that? I asked, trying to get him to keep talking, while my eyes darted around the room, judging if I should bolt for the door or attempt to overpower the older, though more brawny man. This, said Joe, gazing fondly at his little tool, is the only thing I was able to take back with me from the future. It's sort of like a Swiss Army knife, in that depending on which button you press, it can transform into any number of useful items. However, you will come to know it as the traveling shovel of death. With this, he poked a red button on the end of the pencil. I watched as it grew very quickly to the size of a large, heavy, rather menacing-looking shovel that Joe hefted in both hands before rearing it back to take a swing at me. My receptionist in the other room was an elderly lady named Manya, but neither I nor any other person I had ever heard of had called her anything other than Signora Piscatellini. Manya! I screamed at the top of my lungs as I attempted to duck away from the oncoming swing of the traveling shovel of death. The Carabinieri took Joe to jail, where he died barely 2 weeks later of cancer while waiting trial on the murder of Dr. Cicelli. He refused to speak even a single word during the time in custody, so no one ever found out why he had committed such a heinous act upon a man everyone in Rome agreed was a kind and generous soul with no real faults to speak of. There was further outrage over this travesty when it was reported that only days after his murderer's death, his widow discovered that she was pregnant with what would have been their first child. The nation wept. Signora Cicelli decided that she and her unborn baby would move out to the country to live with her parents. It would help to get away from the chaos of the city. Besides, she had studied botany in school and looked forward to introducing her little boy or little girl to nature. Perhaps the two of them would grow a garden and tend it together at some time in the future. She made a mental note to eventually pick up some pods for planting. Somewhere, hundreds of years in the future, the trees laughed.
That was A Mistaken Time. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, share, and subscribe. And there's other stories and novels here on my YouTube page. And if you like them, you might want to check out my Patreon at The Purple Robe. Thanks.